Hey guys, just a quick thank you to all of you amazing legends that are subscribed. I could not have done it without you. But most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please do us a favor and hit the subscribe button and like this video. It's free and it really helps our small team out. Thank you. It all started when my friend's boyfriend decided to play matchmaker. He had this friend, Harry, who we swore was the perfect guy for me. Handsome, successful, and supposedly a real gentleman. After weeks of pestering, I finally gave in and agreed to meet him. From the moment Harry suggested we meet at 10:50 p.m., I should have known something was off. Who picked such an oddly specific time for a first date? But I brushed it off, thinking maybe he had a busy schedule or was just being precise. He emphasized being punctual, which I found a bit strange, but I figured he was just a stickler for time. As I got ready for the date, I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. I spent way too long picking out the perfect outfit and doing my makeup. Looking back, I can't believe I put in so much effort for what turned out to be such a short encounter. I arrived at the restaurant right on time, my heart pounding as I spotted Harry waiting outside. I had to admit he was even more attractive in person than the photos I'd seen. Tall, with dark hair and piercing eyes, he looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine. He greeted me with a warm smile and a quick hug, and for a moment, I thought maybe this could be the start of something great. We walked into the restaurant, a trendy new place downtown with dim lighting and eclectic decor. The hostess led us to a small table near the bar, and as we sat down, I noticed Harry glancing at his watch. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to first date nerves. As we settled in, I expected us to start looking at the menus and maybe order some drinks. But Harry seemed distracted, his eyes darting around the room and occasionally back to his watch. He asked me about my job in marketing, but before I could even finish explaining my role, he moved on to another topic. I tried to keep the conversation flowing, asking him about his work in finance and his interest in CrossFit. He gave short, clipped answers, never really elaborating or showing much interest in getting to know me. It felt less like a date and more like a rushed interview. As the minutes ticked by, Harry's fidgeting increased. He kept shifting in his seat and checking his watch more frequently. I was starting to feel uncomfortable, wondering if I had done something wrong or if he was just not interested. Just when I thought about suggesting we order some drinks to ease the tension, Harry dropped the bombshell. He abruptly announced that he had to leave. Apparently, he had somewhere important to be at 11 p.m. sharp. I sat there, stunned, as he stood up and gathered his things. I couldn't believe what was happening. We had been there for barely 10 minutes. Who schedules a date for such a short time? And who leaves in the middle of a first meeting to go somewhere else? I felt a mix of confusion, embarrassment, and anger as I watched Harry prepare to leave. As if the situation wasn't bizarre enough. Harry then had the audacity to ask if I'd like to go on a second date sometime. I was too shocked to respond. He just smiled, said goodbye, and rushed out the door, leaving me sitting alone at the table, my mouth hanging open in disbelief. The waiter approached, looking as confused as I felt. I mumbled something about a change of plans and quickly gathered my things. As I walked out of the restaurant, I could feel the eyes of other diners on me. My cheeks burned with embarrassment. Once in my car, I sat for a moment trying to process what had just happened. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was this some kind of elaborate prank? I couldn't wrap my head around Harry's behavior. On the drive home, my shock turned to anger. How dare he waste my time like that? I had spent hours getting ready, rearranged my schedule, and even turned down other plans for this date. And for what? 10 minutes of awkward small talk and a rushed exit. As soon as I got home, I called my friend. I needed to vent about this disaster of a date. She was just as baffled as I was. We spent an hour on the phone, trying to come up with explanations for Harry's behavior. Was he secretly married? Did he have some kind of social anxiety? Was he actually a spy on a time-sensitive mission? None of our theories made sense. My friend felt terrible for setting me up with such a weirdo. She said her boyfriend had no idea Harry would act like this. Apparently, he always seemed normal and friendly when they hung out. I couldn't help but wonder if Harry treated all his dates this way or if I was just special. The next day, I was still fuming about the incident. I decided to block Harry's number, just in case he actually tried to follow up for that second date he mentioned. There was no way I was giving him another chance to waste my time. Some friends suggested I should have followed him to see where he was going. Others thought I should have demanded an explanation before he left. But in the end, I was glad I had just let him go. Whatever his deal was, it clearly wasn't worth my time or energy. So my date with Harry became nothing more than a funny story to tell at parties. a cautionary tale about the perils of blind dates and the importance of clear communication. And while it wasn't the romantic evening I had hoped for, at least I got a memorable experience out of it, even if it was only 10 minutes long. I had a first date with a girl named Tara I'd matched with on a dating app. We'd been chatting for a couple weeks, and she seemed sweet and funny. I was excited to finally meet her in person. We agreed to meet at Luigi's, a cozy Italian place downtown. I got there early and waited outside, scanning the faces of people walking by. When Tara arrived, she looked just like her profile pics, petite with long dark hair and a nice smile. We hugged hello and headed inside. The restaurant was bustling with a dinner crowd. We squeezed into a small booth near the back and ordered some wine. At first, everything was going great. Tara was bubbly and talkative, telling me about her job as a vet tech and asking lots of questions about my work in it. The conversation flowed easily as we shared stories and joked around. Our food arrived and we dug in, still chatting away. About halfway through the meal, Tara excused herself to use the restroom. As she stood up, her purse slipped off her lap and spilled open on the floor. I quickly bent down to help her gather her things. That's when I saw it, a gleaming knife partially concealed among the usual purse contents. My stomach dropped. It wasn't just a small pocket knife, but a large blade that looked more suited for hunting than everyday use. Why on earth would she be carrying something like that? I tried to act normal as I handed Tara her purse, but my mind was racing. There had to be some explanation, right? When Tara returned, I found it hard to focus on our conversation. I kept glancing at her purse, wondering about that knife. Was she planning to use it? Should I be worried? Tara didn't seem to notice my unease and kept chatting away about her favorite TV shows. As we finished eating, Tara suggested we go back to her place for drinks. Every instinct told me to make an excuse and leave, but I was afraid of how she might react if I turned her down. What if she got angry and pulled out that knife? So I reluctantly agreed, figuring I could find a way to leave once we got there. The drive to Tara's apartment was tense. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, hyper-aware of her sitting next to me with that purse in her lap. She cut out a stream of cheerful small talk, completely oblivious to my growing anxiety. I tried to keep my responses casual while my mind raced through worst-case scenarios. When we arrived, Tara unlocked the door and ushered me inside. Her place was small but tidy, with lots of framed photos on the walls. As I glanced around, more red flags jumped out at me. There was an unusually large knife block on the kitchen counter, way bigger than any home cook would need. A decorative sword hung over the fireplace. Even the coat rack by the door bristled with pointy umbrella tips. My heart was pounding as Tara headed to the kitchen to pour us drinks. I needed to get out of there fast. I called out that I was going to use the bathroom, then quietly slipped out the front door instead. Once outside, I sprinted to my car and peeled out of there as fast as I could. As I drove home, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see Tara's car following me. But the streets behind me were empty. I didn't fully relax until I was safely back in my own apartment with the door locked. I lay awake for hours that night, replaying the evening in my head. Had I overreacted? Maybe Tara just had some quirky decorating tastes and kept the knife for self-defense. But my gut told me something wasn't right. The way she'd acted so normal while carrying a concealed weapon was unsettling. The next morning, I woke up groggy from lack of sleep. As I scrolled through my phone, my blood ran cold. There was a text from Tara. Had a great time last night. When can I see you again? I stared at the message, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to confront her about the knife, but another part was afraid of provoking her. In the end, I decided ghosting was the safest option. I blocked Tara's number and unmatched with her on the dating app. It felt cowardly, but I didn't want to risk any further contact. I kept replaying worst-case scenarios of what might have happened if I'd stayed at her place. For weeks afterwards, I found myself looking over my shoulder whenever I was out, half expecting to see Tara. Every time I spotted a petite woman with long dark hair, my heart would race until I confirmed it wasn't her. I started avoiding that part of town where she lived just in case. It's a story I sometimes share with close friends over drinks. We've all had our share of bad dates, but mine definitely takes the cake. While I can laugh about it now, in the moment it was genuinely terrifying. I'm just grateful things didn't take an even darker turn. So that's the tale of my date night gone wrong. The town I thought I was headed for a fun evening out and ended up fleeing someone's apartment in fear. It's not the romantic story I hoped for when I first matched with Tara, but it's certainly memorable. And hey, at least the pasta was good. The evening had started off so promising. I'd matched with Grant on a dating app last week, and after some witty banter, we'd agreed to meet for dinner. I spent way too long getting ready, second guessing my outfit choice and redoing my makeup twice. By the time I arrived at the restaurant, my nerves were on edge. Grant showed up right on time, looking even more handsome than his profile pictures. He greeted me with a warm smile and a gentle hug. As we settled into our table, I felt myself starting to relax. The conversation flowed easily over appetizers. Grant was charming and attentive, asking thoughtful questions about my job and hobbies. He had a great sense of humor, making me laugh with stories about his disaster of a first apartment after college. By the time our entrees arrived, I was feeling optimistic about where this might lead. As we finished our meals, Grant suggested we take a walk to a nearby dessert spot. The weather was perfect for an evening stroll, so I agreed. We left the restaurant and headed down the sidewalk, our shoulders occasionally brushing as we walked. The dessert cafe was cozy and intimate. We settled into a small table in the corner, our knees nearly touching underneath. Grant insisted on ordering us a slice of chocolate cake to share. As we talked over bites of rich, decadent cake, he reached across the table to brush a crumb from my cheek. The gesture was sweet, but something about it made me tense up slightly. As we finished dessert, I found myself growing uncomfortable. Grant kept leaning in close, his hand lingering on my arm when he laughed at my jokes. The initial spark I'd felt was fading, replaced by an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. I decided to be honest. Taking a deep breath, I gently explained that while I had a nice time, I wasn't feeling a romantic connection. I thanked him for the evening and said I should be heading home. Grant's entire demeanor changed in an instant. His eyes hardened as he stared at me, his jaw clenching tight. The silence stretched out for what felt like an eternity. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and angry. He couldn't believe I was rejecting him so quickly. No one ever gave him a real chance. My heart started racing as Grant's voice got louder. He demanded to know what was wrong with him, why I didn't like him. People at nearby tables were starting to stare. I felt my face flush with fear and embarrassment. I stood up abruptly, needing to get away. Grant jumped up too, grabbing my wrist. I yanked my arm back, nearly knocking over my chair. When I said I was calling an Uber, Grant insisted on driving me home himself. There was no way I was getting in a car with him. I firmly declined and turned to leave. As I hurried out of the cafe, I could hear Grant's footsteps behind me. He called out, telling me to wait. I walked faster, fumbling for my phone with shaking hands. I needed to get somewhere safe and fast. I spotted a convenience store up ahead and ducked inside. Pretending to browse, I ordered an Uber with trembling fingers. To my horror, Grant followed me in moments later. He hovered nearby, watching my every move. I tried to act normal, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. When my ride notification came through, I bolted for the door. Grant was right on my heels, demanding to know where I was going. As I reached for the car door, he grabbed my arm again. I twisted away and dove into the back seat, slamming the door shut just as Grant tried to reach in after me. As we pulled away, I saw Grant in the rearview mirror. He was standing in the middle of the street, his face contorted with rage. I slumped back against the seat, my whole body trembling. The driver asked if I was okay. I nodded weakly and gave him an address for a diner across town. During the ride, my phone buzzed constantly with texts from Grant. Each one was angrier than the last. He accused me of leading him on, of being a tease. The final message chilled me to the bone. I'm not letting you get away that easily. I asked the driver to drop me at the 24-hour diner, not wanting to risk going home in case Grant had somehow followed us. As I hurried inside, I scanned the parking lot nervously. No sign of him yet, but I didn't feel safe. I settled into a corner booth, ordering a coffee with shaking hands. I texted my best friend, explaining the situation and begging her to come get me. She replied immediately, saying she was on her way. My friend drove us straight to the police station. An officer took my statement, his face grim as I recounted the evening's events. He assured me they'd look into it and advised me to block Grant's number. It was nearly dawn by the time we left the station. My friend insisted I stay at her place for a few days, just to be safe. As we drove to her apartment, the adrenaline finally started to fade. Exhaustion hit me like a wave. Curled up on my friend's couch, wrapped in a soft blanket, I finally felt the tension start to leave my body. Sleep tugged at my eyelids. My last conscious thought before drifting off was gratitude, for trusting my instincts, for the kindness of the diner waitress, for my friend's unwavering support. I was safe, at least for now. After a week of witty banter with Ginny, we decided to meet at a trendy new Italian place downtown. I arrived early, nervously adjusting my shirt and checking my breath. When Ginny walked in, my jaw nearly dropped. She was even more stunning in person, with bright green eyes and a warm smile that lit up the room. The conversation flowed easily as we settled in. We laughed over our shared love of bad reality TV and swapped stories about our most embarrassing moments. By the time our appetizers arrived, I was already thinking about when I could see her again. Everything was going perfectly until halfway through our main course. Ginny had just taken a bite of her mushroom risotto when she started coughing slightly. At first, I didn't think much of it, but within seconds, the coughing intensified. Her face flushed red, and she clutched at her throat, eyes wide with panic. My heart raced as I realized something was seriously wrong. I asked if she was okay, but she just shook her head, unable to speak. Other diners were starting to stare. I fumbled for my phone, hand shaking as I dialed 911. While I waited for the operator to pick up, Ginny's eyes rolled back and she slumped forward onto the table, unconscious. The next few minutes were chaos. I shouted for help, my voice cracking with fear. A man at a nearby table yelled that he was a doctor and rushed over. He checked Ginny's pulse and started chest compressions. The restaurant manager appeared with a first aid kit, looking pale and unsure what to do. I paced back and forth, feeling utterly helpless as I relayed information to the 911 operator. Patrons were asked to clear the area. Some left in a hurry, while others lingered, craning their necks to see what was happening. The once lively restaurant had fallen eerily silent except for the doctor's counting as he continued CPR. When the paramedics finally burst through the door, I nearly cried with relief. They quickly took over, attaching monitors and administering medication. One of them asked me rapid-fire questions about Ginny's medical history, but I could barely stammer out that we'd only just met. The realization that I knew almost nothing about her hit me like a punch to the gut. As they loaded Ginny onto a stretcher, I caught a glimpse of her face. She looked so pale and lifeless, nothing like the vibrant woman who'd walked in an hour ago. One of the paramedics explained they suspected a severe allergic reaction. My mind raced, trying to remember everything she'd eaten. Had I missed some warning sign? I followed the ambulance to the hospital, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The waiting room was crowded, but I barely noticed the other worried faces around me. Time seemed to crawl by as I waited for news, imagining every worst-case scenario. After what felt like hours, a doctor finally approached me. The relief that washed over me when he said Ginny would be okay was indescribable. It turned out she had a severe peanut allergy she didn't know about. There must have been cross-contamination in the kitchen. The doctor explained that if the ambulance had arrived even a few minutes later, the outcome could have been very different. They were keeping Ginny overnight for observation, but I was allowed to see her briefly. She looked exhausted, hooked up to various monitors, but managed a weak smile when I walked in. We didn't say much. She was still groggy from the medication. I just held her hand and told her how glad I was that she was all right. As I drove home in the early hours of the morning, my mind kept replaying the events of the night. The sound of Ginny gasping for breath, the look of fear in her eyes, the tense silence as the doctor performed CPR. These images were seared into my memory. The next day, I woke up to a text from Ginny. She thanked me for my quick action and said the doctors told her it likely saved her life. Despite everything, she wanted to see me again once she was recovered. I was touched and amazed by her resilience. Over the next week, I found myself constantly checking in on Ginny. I sent her funny memes to cheer her up and even dropped off some nut-free snacks at the hospital. When she was finally discharged, I offered to drive her home. The car ride was a bit awkward at first. After all, we'd only had half a first date before all hell broke loose. But soon we were laughing about the absurdity of it all. We decided to have a do-over date, this time in a place with a nut-free kitchen. I arrived early again, but this time it wasn't just first date jitters making my heart race. When Ginny walked in, looking healthy and radiant, I felt a wave of emotion wash over me. We hugged for a long moment, both of us aware of how differently things could have turned out. As we settled in and started chatting, it felt like no time had passed. We picked up right where we left off, but now with an added layer of shared experience. We swapped hospital stories and joked about making sure all our future dates were EpiPen friendly. Towards the end of the evening, Ginny grew serious for a moment. She told me that the whole experience had made her realize life was too short to waste time. Then, with a mischievous glint in her eye, she asked if I'd like to be her emergency contact. I laughed and said I'd be honored, as long as she promised to stick to nut-free restaurants from now on. As we left the restaurant hand in hand, I marveled at how differently this night had ended compared to our first date. What started as a disaster had somehow brought us closer together. I didn't know what the future held for Ginny and me, but I was excited to find out, one nut-free meal at a time. When Ollie asked me out to dinner, I was thrilled. Little did I know how quickly things would go south. The evening started off great. We met at a cozy Italian place downtown, and Ollie looked even better in person than in his photos. Tall, with warm brown eyes and a killer smile, he pulled out my chair and ordered us a bottle of wine. As we nibbled on breadsticks, the conversation flowed easily. We swapped stories about work, laughed about our horrible first jobs, and discovered we both loved hiking. Our entrees arrived, a steaming plate of fettuccine for me and lasagna for Ollie. The food was delicious, and I found myself getting lost in Ollie's stories about his travels through Europe. He asked thoughtful questions about my family and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. By the time we got to dessert, I was feeling pretty smitten. When the check came, Ollie immediately reached for it. I offered to split it, but he insisted on paying. It was a sweet gesture, and I felt a warm glow of attraction. As we left the restaurant, Ollie put his hand on the small of my back to guide me through the door. His touch sent a little chill through me. The night air was crisp as we walked towards the parking lot where we'd both left our cars. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, already looking forward to our next date. That's when everything changed in an instant. Ollie's hand moved from my back to grip my upper arm. At first, I thought he was just being playful, but his fingers dug in uncomfortably tight. He leaned in close, his breath hot on my ear as he murmured that I could pay him back for dinner another way. His tone made my skin crawl. I tried to laugh it off, assuming he was making a bad joke. But when I looked up at his face, his eyes were hard and his jaw was set. This wasn't the warm, funny guy from dinner. My stomach dropped as I realized how quickly the situation had changed. I gently tried to pull my arm away, but Ollie's grip only tightened. My mind raced as I tried to figure out how to get out of this. We were alone in a dark parking lot. I didn't want to make a scene in case it provoked him, but I also knew I needed to get away fast. Forcing a smile, I told Ollie I had an early meeting the next day and really needed to get home. He frowned and said we should go back to his place for a nightcap first. My heart was pounding now. I firmly said no and tried again to pull away. This time, Ollie let go of my arm, but he stepped in front of me, blocking my path to my car. He towered over me, his body language aggressive. I felt so small and vulnerable. How had this night gone so wrong so fast? I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. In a steady voice, I told Ollie I wasn't comfortable and wanted to leave. For a long moment, he just stared at me. I could see anger flashing in his eyes. My legs felt wobbly, but I stood my ground and held his gaze. Finally, Ollie stepped aside with a scoff. He muttered something about me being a tease. I walked as quickly as I could to my car without running, fumbling for my keys. I could feel Ollie's eyes on me the whole time. Once inside my car, I locked the doors immediately. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I saw Ollie still standing there watching me leave. I didn't breathe easily until I was on the highway heading home. The whole drive, I couldn't stop replaying the night in my head. How had I misjudged Ollie so badly? He'd seemed so nice online and during dinner, but clearly that was just an act. The way he'd switched so abruptly from charming to threatening terrified me. When I got home, I double-checked that all my doors and windows were locked. I felt jumpy and on edge. Part of me wanted to call a friend, but I felt embarrassed about what had happened. I should have been more careful, should have seen the warning signs. I barely slept that night, tossing and turning as my mind kept conjuring worst-case scenarios of what could have happened. The next morning, I woke up feeling drained and shaky. I considered calling in sick to work, but decided I needed the distraction. At the office, I went through the motions in a daze. I kept thinking I saw Ollie out of the corner of my eye. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart raced thinking it might be him, but he never contacted me again. Over the next few days, the fear slowly faded, but I was left shaken and wary. I'd always considered myself a good judge of character. Now I questioned my own instincts. How could I trust my feelings about someone again? It took me a while to feel ready to date again. When I did, I was much more cautious. I always met in public places and told friends where I was going. I watched carefully for any red flags or controlling behavior. I don't know if I'll ever feel completely safe again, but I refuse to let one bad experience define my whole life. I'm moving forward one day at a time, and if Ollie ever does show his face again, I'll be ready. This time I won't be caught off guard. The evening started like any other first date. I've been chatting with Jada on a dating app for about a week, and we decided to meet at a cozy Italian restaurant downtown. As I walked in, I spotted her immediately long dark hair, warm smile, just like her profile pictures. My nerves settled a bit as we sat down and started looking over the menus. The conversation flowed easily at first. We talked about our jobs, our hobbies, the usual first date small talk. I was starting to think this might actually go well. Then Jada asked if I'd been to the new hiking trail that opened up last month. I hadn't, but mentioned I like to go hiking on weekends when I could. That's when things took a turn. Jada's eyes lit up, and she asked if I ever took Max with me on trails. I felt my stomach drop. I'd never said anything about having a dog, let alone his name. When I asked how she knew about Max, she just laughed it off, saying she was good at guessing things about people. My mind was racing. Had I mentioned Max earlier and forgotten? No, I was sure I hadn't. So how did she know? As the date went on, more little comments set off alarm bells. She brought up my favorite coffee shop that I go to every morning, but I'd never told her where I get my daily caffeine fix. She made a joke about my crazy ex-girlfriend from college, but I'd never talked about past relationships with her. I tried to play it cool, but inside I was freaking out. It was clear Jada knew way more about me than she should. Had she been stalking me online? Or worse, following me in real life? I racked my brain trying to figure out how she could have gotten all this information. We'd only been chatting on the dating app for a week before meeting up. I kept my social media pretty locked down. Something wasn't adding up. As our meals arrived, I found myself watching Jada closely, trying to figure her out. She seemed normal enough on the surface, laughing at my jokes, telling stories about her job. But there was an intensity behind her eyes that unnerved me, like she was studying my every move. I started testing her, bringing up random topics to see what else she might know. When I mentioned wanting to visit Japan someday, she immediately started talking about the Cherry Blossom Festival I'd posted about on Instagram last year. But my Instagram was private. How had she seen that? My appetite was long gone at this point. I pushed my pasta around the plate, trying to figure out my next move. Part of me wanted to confront her directly, demand to know how she knew so much about me. But another part was scared of how she might react, if she really had been stalking me. I spent the next few hours combing through all my social media, tightening privacy settings and looking for any signs that someone had been snooping. I even called a tech-savvy friend to see if he could check if my accounts had been hacked. He couldn't find anything suspicious, which only made me more paranoid. I barely slept that night, jumping at every little noise. The next morning, I went straight to the police station to file a report. The officer was sympathetic, but said there wasn't much they could do without more concrete evidence of stalking. He suggested I block Jada's number and be extra vigilant about my surroundings for a while. Over the next few days, I was constantly on edge. I varied my routines, taking different routes to work and stopping at new coffee shops. I kept expecting to see Jada lurking around every corner, but there was no sign of her. Just when I was starting to relax, thinking maybe I'd overreacted, I got home one night to find a note taped to my door. It simply said, "Miss you already. See you soon. with a little heart drawn next to it. My blood ran cold. How had she found out where I lived? In a panic, I called the police again. They sent an officer over to take a report, but again, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested I consider moving or at least staying with a friend for a while. I stayed with a friend for the night, and luckily it has been months now and I haven't heard anything from her, but boy, what a strange and scary night it was. It all started with a simple swipe right on a dating app. Ryan's profile had caught my eye. His photo showed a clean-cut guy with a warm smile and a sense of style. We chatted for a week, and everything seemed perfect. But the moment he walked into the restaurant, my heart sank. The man approaching my table looked nothing like the Ryan I'd been talking to. He was easily a decade older, with unkempt hair and a stained shirt. His smile was more of a leer, and I felt a chill run down my spine as he slid into the booth across from me. I tried to keep my composure, hoping there was some mistake, but when he used my name, I knew this was my date. He must have noticed my shocked expression because he quickly mumbled something about not updating his profile picture. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The waiter came over and I ordered a water, buying time to collect my thoughts. Ryan, if that was even his real name, got a beer. I couldn't help but notice his hands shaking as he lifted the glass to his lips. Was he nervous, or was something else going on? I attempted small talk, asking about his job. He gave vague answers, quickly changing the subject each time. His eyes darted around the restaurant constantly, as if he was looking for someone or worried about being seen. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, but I felt frozen in place. When our food arrived, I could barely bring myself to eat. The knot in my stomach had killed my appetite. Ryan, on the other hand, had devoured his meal like he hadn't eaten in days. He kept accidentally brushing against my hand or arm, making me flinch each time. I tried to lean away, but the booth didn't give me much room to maneuver. I excused myself to use the restroom, desperate for a moment to think. Once inside, I pulled out my phone and texted my roommate, explaining the situation and begging her to call me with an emergency in 10 minutes. It wasn't the most original plan, but I was running out of options. Returning to the table, I found Ryan had moved to sit next to me instead of across. My skin crawled as he scooted closer, effectively trapping me against the wall. He started talking about how we should get out of here and go somewhere more private. His breath smelled of alcohol and something else I couldn't identify. I checked my phone constantly, willing it to ring. The minutes felt like hours. Ryan's hand found its way to my knee, and I had to resist the urge to slap it away. I was afraid of how he might react if I openly rejected him. When my phone finally rang, I almost cried with relief. I made a show of looking concerned, telling Ryan I had to go. My roommate had locked herself out and lost her spare key. He offered to drive me, his eyes gleaming in a way that made me feel sick. I declined, saying I already called a ride. He insisted on waiting with me outside. Trapped, I agreed, hoping there'd be witnesses if he tried anything. Outside, he stood too close, breathing heavily. I kept my phone in my hand, finger hovering over the emergency call button. Every car that drove by made me tense, wondering if it was my escape. Rand kept trying to put his arm around me, and I had to keep finding excuses to step away. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted my roommate's car. Without thinking, I bolted towards it, calling a quick goodbye over my shoulder. Ryan yelled something after me, but I didn't stop to listen. I dove into the passenger seat, and my roommate sped away before I'd even closed the door. As we drove, the adrenaline started to wear off, and I began shaking uncontrollably. My roommate asked if I wanted to report him, but I just wanted to forget the whole thing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something terrible. At home, I deleted my dating app and took a long hot shower, trying to wash away the memory of Ryan's touch. I felt dirty even though nothing had really happened. I kept replaying the night in my head, wondering if I'd missed any red flags earlier in our conversations. That night, I barely slept. Every noise made me jump, convinced Ryan had somehow found out where I lived. In the light of day, I knew I was being irrational, but the fear lingered. Over the next few weeks, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. I jumped at shadows and loud noises. Every time I saw someone who looked vaguely like Ryan, my heart raced. I stopped going out as much, preferring the safety of my apartment. My friends tried to cheer me up, telling me it was just one bad date, but they didn't understand the fear I'd felt, the certainty that something was deeply wrong with Ryan. I couldn't shake the image of his shaking hands, his darting eyes, the way he practically inhaled his food. Slowly, I started to regain my confidence. I went back to work, started going out with friends again. But I was different now, more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I found myself studying the faces of strangers, looking for any hint of deception. Now, when I tell the story, it feels almost unreal, like something out of a movie or a crime show. But it happened, and it opened my eyes to the potential dangers lurking behind friendly profile pictures and charming messages. It's a reminder that in the world of online dating and in life, not everything is as it seems. The night had started so perfectly. Wendy and I hit it off right away over dinner, laughing and talking like old friends. But as we stepped out of the restaurant, everything changed in an instant. We were walking to our cars, the cool night air a refreshing change from the stuffy restaurant. The parking lot was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the cracked asphalt. That's when we heard it, shouting, angry, aggressive, cutting through the quiet evening. At first, I thought it was just some rowdy bargoers. This part of town could get a bit wild on weekends, but as we got closer to our cars, I realized it was more serious. Two men were squaring off, fists clenched, faces contorted with rage. A small crowd had gathered, some egging them on, others trying to calm things down. I glanced at Wendy, seeing the concern in her eyes. I suggested we take a detour, maybe walk around the block until things cooled off. But before we could turn away, one of the men pulled out a knife. The blade glinted in the dim light, and suddenly the atmosphere shifted from tense to terrifying. The crowd scattered, leaving just the two men facing each other. We were caught in the middle, our cars frustratingly close yet impossibly far. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to figure out what to do. I'm not a fighter, and I had no idea how to handle a situation like this. I felt Wendy's hand grip mine tightly. Her palm was sweaty, or maybe it was mine. I looked around frantically, searching for an escape route or someone who could help. But the street was deserted except for us, and the two men locked in their deadly standoff. The man with a knife lunged forward, slashing wildly. His opponent dodged, barely avoiding the blade. They grappled, twisting and turning, each trying to gain the upper hand. I watched in horror, frozen in place, as they moved closer to where Wendy and I stood. Suddenly, the knife clattered to the ground, skidding across the pavement. Without thinking, I darted forward and kicked it away, sending it sliding under a nearby car. The men barely seemed to notice, too focused on their fight to pay attention to me. I rushed back to Wendy, grabbing her hand. "Run," I yelled, pulling her towards the side street I had spotted. We took off, our footsteps echoing in the quiet night. I could hear sirens in the distance growing louder. Someone must have called the police. We ran for what felt like miles, though it was probably only a few blocks. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. Finally, we ducked into an all-night diner, collapsing into a booth as we tried to catch our breath. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow over the worn formica tables. A tired-looking waitress brought us coffee without asking, clearly used to late-night patrons in various states of distress. As the adrenaline wore off, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. We sat in silence for a while, hands wrapped around our mugs, trying to process the events of the night. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, wondering if I could have done something differently. After a while, Wendy spoke up, her voice shaky. She asked if I thought it was safe to go back for our cars. I shook my head, explaining that the police were probably still there, and it might be best to wait it out. She nodded, looking relieved that she didn't have to go back just yet. We spent the next few hours in that diner, talking in low voices about what had happened. We speculated about what might have started the fight, wondering if the men knew each other or if it was a random altercation. The waitress refilled our coffee cups periodically, giving us curious looks but not asking any questions. As the night wore on, other customers came and went. The early morning crowd started to trickle in, night shift workers grabbing breakfast, early risers getting their caffeine fix. We must have looked a sight, still in our date night clothes, disheveled and tired. Finally, as the sky began to lighten, we decided it was probably safe to head back. We called a rideshare, both of us too exhausted to walk. The driver gave us an odd look as we climbed in, but didn't comment on our appearance or the early hour. The parking lot was empty when we arrived, no sign of the fight that had occurred just hours before. Our cars sat undisturbed, looking exactly as we had left them. It felt surreal, like the whole night had been a strange dream. We stood there for a moment, neither of us quite sure what to say. How do you end a date that went so wildly off course? Wendy broke the silence, suggesting we exchange numbers and check in later to make sure we both got home safely. I agreed, relief washing over me that she wasn't completely put off by the night's events. As we prepared to go our separate ways, Wendy surprised me by leaning in for a hug. "Thanks for keeping us safe," she whispered. I hugged her back, feeling a mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. We got into our respective cars, both of us looking a little worse for wear. As I watched Wendy drive away, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd ever see her again. It had been one hell of a first date, that was for sure. On the drive home, my mind raced with thoughts of the night. The perfect dinner, the terrifying confrontation, the long hours in the diner. It wasn't at all how I had imagined the evening going, but in a strange way, I felt like I had gotten to know Wendy better than I would have on a typical first date. We slowly lost contact, but it was because of other reasons. Anyway, that was my craziest first date story. I knew I shouldn't have let him pick me up, but he insisted it would be easier. The moment I stepped into his car, a chill ran down my spine. Something felt off, but I brushed it aside, chalking it up to first date jitters. He pulled away from my apartment, and we chatted about trivial things on the way to the restaurant. I noticed he took a few wrong turns, claiming he was trying a shortcut. By the time we arrived, my nerves were on edge, but I decided to give him the benefit of the doubt. The restaurant was nice with dim lighting and soft music. As we sat down, I made sure to position myself with a clear view of the exits, just in case. He ordered for both of us without asking what I wanted, which irked me, but I stayed quiet. Throughout dinner, he dominated the conversation, barely letting me get a word in. He kept bringing up personal details I didn't remember sharing with him online. It was unsettling, but I convinced myself I must have mentioned these things and forgotten. As we finished our meals, I was ready to call it a night. I politely asked if he could take me home, feigning a headache. He seemed disappointed but agreed. Relief washed over me as we left the restaurant, thinking I'd soon be safe in my apartment. That relief was short-lived. Instead of turning towards my neighborhood, he started driving in the opposite direction. My heart rate spiked as I pointed this out, but he just smiled and said there was something he wanted to show me first. I protested, saying I really needed to get home, but he ignored me and kept driving. The city lights began to fade as we hit the highway. He was driving too fast, weaving between cars with a reckless abandon that made my stomach churn. I gripped the door handle tightly, knuckles turning white. This wasn't right. I tried to stay calm, but panic was rising in my chest. I asked again where we were going, my voice shaking. He just grinned and pressed the gas pedal harder. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. My phone was in my purse on the floor by my feet. If I could just reach it without him noticing, maybe I could call for help. I slowly moved my hand towards my bag, praying he wouldn't see. Just as my fingers brushed the strap, he swerved sharply onto an exit ramp. I was thrown against the door, my head smacking the window. We were now in an industrial area, warehouses looming on either side of the empty street. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. This was bad, really bad. I had to get out of this car. Up ahead, I saw a red light, a glimmer of hope. As we slowed to a stop, I fumbled for the door handle. In one quick motion, I flung it open and tumbled out onto the pavement. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not daring to look back. I could hear him yelling and the screech of tires, but I just kept running. My legs were shaking and my lungs burned, but pure adrenaline kept me going. I spotted a gas station up ahead, its bright lights like a beacon. I sprinted towards it, praying someone would be there. As I burst through the doors, gasping for air, I saw a police officer at the counter. Relief flooded through me as I stumbled towards him. Between sobs, I managed to explain what happened. The officer immediately radioed for backup while the cashier gave me some water and a chair. I heard sirens in the distance growing louder. More officers arrived, asking me questions and taking notes. They sent out patrols to search the area, but there was no sign of him or his car. One of the officers offered to drive me home, which I gratefully accepted. As we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching. Every car that passed made me flinch. The officer tried to reassure me, but his words felt hollow. When we finally reached my apartment, he walked me to the door, making sure I got in safely. Once inside, I collapsed on the couch, still shaking. My roommate rushed over, having been worried sick when I didn't come home on time. As I recounted the night's events, the reality of what could have happened sank in. I felt stupid for ignoring my instincts and getting in that car. The next few days were a blur. I barely slept, jumping at every little noise. The police called with updates, but they hadn't been able to track the guy down yet. His online profile had disappeared, and the license plate I remembered turned out to be fake. A week after the incident, I was walking home from work, constantly looking over my shoulder. As I turned onto my street, I froze. There, parked across from my apartment, was his car. My heart raced as I ducked behind a tree, fumbling for my phone. I dialed 911. As I whispered my location to the dispatcher, I saw him exit the car. He looked around furtively before approaching my building. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't see me. Suddenly, sirens blared in the distance. He whipped around, spotting me behind the tree. Our eyes locked for a moment before he sprinted back to his car. He peeled away just as police cars rounded the corner. The officers took my statement and escorted me inside. They'd assured me they would increase patrols in the area and urged me to stay with friends for a few days. That night, as I packed a bag at my friend's insistence, I couldn't shake the image of his face when he saw me. The look in his eyes told me this wasn't over. For the next month, I lived in constant fear. I changed my routines, varied my routes to work, and never went anywhere alone. My friends and family rallied around me, but I still felt exposed, vulnerable. Then, one ordinary Tuesday, it ended. I was grocery shopping when an officer approached me. They had caught him trying to abduct another woman. He was in custody, and they needed me to identify him. At the station, I stood trembling before the one-way glass. When they brought him in, I felt a mix of fear and relief wash over me. It was him. As I nodded to the detective, I realized it was truly over. He couldn't hurt me or anyone else anymore. Leaving the station, I took a deep breath of the cool evening air. For the first time in weeks, I felt I could breathe freely. The nightmare was over, but its lessons would stay with me forever. I headed home, ready to reclaim my life and my peace of mind. Tina's profile seemed normal enough. Cute photos, shared interests in movies and hiking. We chatted for a few days and decided to meet up at a local cafe. The date began normally. I arrived a few minutes early, grabbed a table, and waited nervously. Tina walked in right on time, looking just like her photos. She smiled warmly as she sat down across from me. We ordered coffee and fell into easy conversation about our favorite films. Everything seemed to be going well. Tina was engaging and funny, laughing at my jokes and sharing stories about her job as a graphic designer. I started to relax, thinking this might actually turn into a good connection. That's when things took a bizarre turn. We were discussing our favorite directors when Tina suddenly grabbed my hand across the table. Her eyes went wide as she stared at me intently. She started rambling about how we were destined to be together and how she'd known I was her soulmate from the moment she saw my profile. I tried to gently extract my hand, feeling uncomfortable with the sudden intensity. But Tina just gripped tighter, her voice rising as she talked about fate and true love. Other cafe patrons were starting to stare. I stammered out something about how we'd only just met, trying to defuse the situation. Before I could say anything else, Tina abruptly stood up. To my horror, she got down on one knee right there in the middle of the crowded cafe. Everyone was watching as she loudly proclaimed her undying love and asked me to marry her. I froze, completely caught off guard and mortified. The whole cafe was silent, waiting expectantly for my response. I panicked and blurted out a yes, just wanting the embarrassing scene to be over. Tina squealed in delight and threw her arms around me. I awkwardly patted her back, my face burning as I avoided eye contact with the other customers. As soon as we left the cafe, I tried to gently explain that things were moving way too fast. I told Tina I wasn't actually ready for marriage and had only said yes due to the pressure of the moment. That's when her demeanor completely changed. Tina's face contorted in anger as she started screaming at me on the sidewalk. She called me a liar and accused me of leading her on. Before I knew what was happening, she picked up a nearby potted plant and hurled it at my head. I ducked just in time as the pot shattered against the wall behind me. Tinda was in a full rage now, grabbing anything she could get her hands on and throwing it my way. A book from her purse, her water bottle, even her shoe came flying at me as I tried to dodge. People on the street stopped to stare at the commotion. I heard someone yell that they were calling the police. I wanted to get out of there, but I was worried about leaving Tina alone in such an unstable state. I tried to calm her down, speaking in a soothing voice, but she wasn't listening. Suddenly, Tina lunged at me with her nails out, scratching my face. I instinctively pushed her away, perhaps harder than I meant to. She stumbled backwards and fell, hitting her head on the concrete sidewalk. For a moment, she just lay there, and I was terrified I'd really hurt her. Then she started wailing dramatically, attracting even more attention. I knelt down to check on her, but she swung at me again, catching my arm with her nails. That's when I heard sirens approaching. 2 police cars pulled up and officers jumped out. They quickly assessed the situation and separated us. An officer gently led me aside while his partner talked to Tina. I tried to explain what had happened as calmly as I could, my hands shaking. The officers took statements from both of us and some witnesses who had seen the whole thing unfold. In the end, they seemed to believe my side of events. They strongly suggested I file for a restraining order against Tina given her erratic and violent behavior. As they led Tina away to their cruiser, she was still yelling threats at me. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but I was also completely shaken up by how quickly things had spiraled out of control. What I thought would be a casual first date had turned into utter chaos. The next day, my face and arms still stinging from Tina's scratches, I went to the courthouse to file for a temporary restraining order. I hated having to take such extreme measures, but Tina's behavior had genuinely frightened me. The judge granted the order after hearing my account of what happened. In the days that followed, I felt on edge any time I was out in public. I kept looking over my shoulder, worried I might run into Tina again. I obsessively checked my phone and social media, afraid she might try to contact me somehow. It's been over a year now since that disastrous first date with Tina. I still think about it sometimes, marveling at how quickly a seemingly normal interaction can go off the rails. While I wouldn't wish that on anyone, it did teach me to trust my instincts and prioritize my safety when meeting new people. These days, I'm back to enjoying the dating scene, albeit with a bit more caution. And when people ask about my worst date ever, I definitely have a story to tell, though I usually leave out some of the more dramatic details. Some things are better left in the past. I'd spent an hour getting ready, trying on different outfits and fixing my hair. I was nervous but excited to finally meet the guy I'd been chatting with online for weeks. The restaurant was bustling when I arrived. I spotted John at a table near the back, looking just like his profile picture. He stood up to greet me with a warm smile that instantly put me at ease. We ordered drinks and dove into conversation, the usual first date small talk about our jobs and hobbies. John was charming and attentive, asking thoughtful questions and laughing at my jokes. I found myself relaxing and enjoying his company. Maybe online dating wasn't so bad after all. We were just finishing our main course when it happened. I was in the middle of telling John about my recent trip to Hawaii when I noticed his face suddenly go pale. He was staring at something behind me, his eyes wide with panic. Before I could turn to see what had spooked him, a woman appeared at our table. Her face was flushed red and her eyes were blazing with anger. She glared at John, completely ignoring me. John seemed frozen in shock. He opened his mouth like he was going to say something, but no words came out. The woman started yelling at him about missed calls and ignored texts. My mind raced to make sense of what was happening. That's what hit me. This wasn't just some ex-girlfriend. The way she was talking, it was clear she thought they were still together. My stomach churned as I realized John had lied about being single. I sat there in stunned silence as the woman continued berating John. Other diners were starting to stare. The manager hurried over, trying to defuse the situation. John finally snapped out of his daze and attempted to calm his girlfriend down, but she was having none of it. She turned her attention to me, demanding to know who I was. I stammered out that I'd met John online, and this was our first date. Her eyes widened in shock, then narrowed in fury. She started screaming at both of us. I felt my face burning with humiliation. How could I have been so foolish? All those sweet messages suddenly felt manipulative and gross. I'd been completely deceived. In a daze, I grabbed my purse and bolted for the door. As I hurried down the sidewalk, I could still hear the woman's angry voice echoing from the restaurant. My cheeks burned with shame and anger. How dare John put me in that position? I ducked into a nearby coffee shop, ordering a latte with shaking hands. Finding a quiet corner, I slumped into a chair and tried to process what had just happened. Part of me wanted to cry. Another part wanted to march back and confront John, but mostly I just felt drained and stupid. As I sipped my drink, I pulled out my phone to delete the dating app. That's when I saw several missed calls and texts from John. He was apologizing profusely, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. I scoffed and blocked his number. I sat there for a while, replaying the evening in my head. Had there been any red flags I'd missed? John had seemed so genuine. I prided myself on being a good judge of character, but clearly I'd been way off base this time. Eventually, I gathered the energy to head home. As I walked, my embarrassment started to give way to anger. How many other women had John fooled? Did he get some sick thrill out of cheating and lying? I wished I'd said something to him before I left, called him out on his deception and cowardice, let him know exactly what I thought of him. But it was too late now. When I got home, I changed into comfy clothes and made some tea. I curled up on the couch with my cat, grateful for his simple, unconditional affection. I thought about calling my best friend to vent, but decided against it. I didn't have the energy to rehash the whole awful evening. As I got ready for bed, I couldn't quite shake the icky feeling. It would be a while before I felt ready to put myself out there again. I tossed and turned for hours, my mind racing with thoughts of John and his girlfriend. The next morning, I woke up feeling slightly better. The shock had worn off, replaced by relief that I had gotten away from that toxic situation. I treated myself to a nice breakfast and decided to spend the day doing things I enjoyed. As I was getting dressed, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was John's girlfriend. She apologized for the scene and thanked me for being honest. Apparently, John had come clean about everything. I wrote back wishing her well, then blocked the number. That chapter was officially closed. I headed out into the sunshine, determined to shake off the drama and salvage my weekend. But as I walked to the park, I spotted a familiar face coming towards me. It was John. My heart started racing as he approached, a desperate look on his face. He tried to explain, saying his girlfriend was actually his ex and things were complicated. I cut him off mid-sentence, telling him I wasn't interested in his excuses. He grabbed my arm as I tried to walk away. That's when I noticed his girlfriend watching us from across the street. She started marching over, looking ready for round two. Panic rising in my throat, I wrenched my arm free and took off running. I could hear John calling after me, but I didn't look back. I ran until my lungs burned, finally stopping when I was sure I'd lost them. Leaning against a building to catch my breath, I realized my peaceful Saturday was shot. There was no way I was risking another run-in with John or his girlfriend. I hailed a cab and went straight to my best friend's apartment. She listened in shock as I recounted the whole sordid tale. We spent the rest of the day binging trashy TV and eating junk food. It wasn't how I planned to spend my weekend, but it was exactly what I needed. By Sunday night, I was feeling more like myself again. The whole experience had been awful, but at least it would make for a good story someday. For now, though, I was done with dating apps and first date dramas. My love life could wait. I matched with Hannah on a dating app. Her profile was intriguing, smart, funny, and drop-dead gorgeous. After chatting for a few weeks, we decided to meet up. That's when things took an unexpected turn. Hannah suggested we meet at Chez Pierre, a high-end French restaurant downtown. I was hesitant at first. It seemed a bit fancy for a first date. But she insisted. Let's treat ourselves, she said. I figured why not? It might be fun to splurge a little. I arrived at the restaurant feeling nervous but excited. The place was intimidatingly posh, with crystal chandeliers and white tablecloths. I tugged at my collar, feeling underdressed in my nicest button-down shirt and slacks. The maitre d' led me to a secluded table near the back. A few minutes later, Hannah walked in. My jaw nearly hit the floor. She looked even more stunning than her photos, wearing a slinky black dress that hugged every curve. Her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her smile lit up the room. As she approached, I stood up awkwardly, nearly knocking over my water glass. We started with small talk as we perused the menu. Hannah seemed charming and confident, laughing at my jokes and maintaining eye contact. When the waiter came over, she took charge of ordering. "We'll start with a bottle of the Chateau Margaux," she said smoothly. I didn't know much about wine, but even I knew that was top shelf stuff. Hannah didn't stop there. She ordered a parade of appetizers: escargot, foie gras, oysters on the half shell. "We have to try everything," she insisted with a wink. I nodded along, trying to ignore the growing knot in my stomach. I hadn't even looked at the prices, but I knew this meal was rapidly exceeding my budget. As we waited for our food, Hannah peppered me with questions about my job, my salary, and my family background. I found it a bit odd, but I chalked it up to first date nerves. Whenever I tried to turn the conversation to her, she skillfully deflected, keeping the focus on me. The appetizers arrived, a dizzying array of tiny, elaborate dishes. Hannah dug in enthusiastically, encouraging me to try everything. She kept refilling my wine glass, insisting I drink up. "This vintage is meant to be enjoyed," she said. Between the rich food and the alcohol, I was starting to feel a bit fuzzy-headed. When it came time for the main course, Hannah ordered the lobster for herself and the filet mignon for me. "You look like a steak man," she said with a grin. I wanted to protest. I'm more of a burger guy, honestly, but I didn't want to seem difficult. Throughout the meal, Hannah kept the conversation flowing. She was witty and engaging, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She seemed almost too perfect, too rehearsed, and she kept steering the topic back to my finances in a way that made me uneasy. By the time dessert rolled around, I was stuffed and more than a little tipsy. Hannah insisted we try both the chocolate souffle and the creme brulee. "Life's too short to skip dessert," she said. I nodded weakly, wondering how I was going to pay for all this. Finally, after what felt like hours, the waiter brought the check. Hannah reached for it first, glancing at the total. Her eyes widened slightly, but she quickly composed herself. "Oh my," she said with a little laugh. "We really went all out, didn't we? I need to freshen up before we deal with this." Back in a flash. She grabbed her purse and headed towards the restrooms. I sat there nervously, eyeing the bill. Part of me wanted to peek at the total, but another part was too scared to look. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. A sinking feeling began to grow in the pit of my stomach. I asked the waiter if he'd seen my date. He shook his head, looking concerned. I got up and checked the hallway of the restrooms. No sign of Hannah. That's when I knew I'd been had. With trembling hands, I finally looked at the bill. The total made my head spin: $742.86. There was no way I could afford this. I had maybe $100 in my checking account and maxed out credit card with a $500 limit. I sat there in shock, my mind racing. I barely knew this woman, and I'd let her order half the menu without a second thought. Now here I was abandoned with a bill I couldn't pay and no way out. I considered making a run for it, but I knew I'd never make it past the staff. Plus, the thought of dining and dashing made me feel sick. I was raised better than that. I took some deep breaths, trying to quell my rising panic. After agonizing for a few more minutes, I waved the waiter over. Red-faced and stammering, I explained what had happened. To my immense relief, he was understanding. He went to get the manager, who thankfully was sympathetic as well. We worked out a deal where I would pay what I could now and set up a payment plan for the rest. I emptied my wallet and maxed out my credit card, covering about half the bill. The manager took down my information and had me sign an agreement to pay the remainder in installments. As I left the restaurant, utterly humiliated, I couldn't help scanning the street for any sign of Hannah. There was no trace of her. It was like she had vanished into thin air, leaving me with an empty wallet and a bruised ego. The next day, still reeling from what happened, I tried to message Hannah on the dating app. Her profile was gone. I did some digging online and found similar stories from other guys in the area. It seemed Hannah, or whatever her real name was, had pulled this scam before. I filed a police report, but they said there wasn't much they could do without more information. I was angry at Hannah, but even angrier at myself for falling for it. I should have trusted my gut when things started feeling off. It took me nearly 6 months to pay off the rest of that dinner bill. Every time I transferred money to the restaurant, I felt a fresh wave of embarrassment. The experience left me wary of dating for a long time. When I finally felt ready to try again, I suggested coffee for first dates. Much stickier that way. I've been chatting with Tim online for a few weeks. He seemed charming, witty, and we shared a lot of common interests. When he suggested meeting up at a cozy cafe downtown, I eagerly agreed. I spent extra time getting ready, wanting to make a good impression. The cafe was bustling when I arrived. Tin was already there, waving from a corner table. He looked just like his profile picture, tall, dark-haired, with a warm smile. My nerves eased as we started talking. The conversation was good. We were jumping from topic to topic. We laughed about silly childhood memories and debated our favorite movies. Tin was attentive, asking thoughtful questions and seeming genuinely interested in my responses. As we finished our coffees, Tim suggested a walk in the nearby park. The evening was mild with a gentle breeze, perfect for a stroll. We wandered along the winding paths, still deep in conversation. The park was quiet, with only a few other people around. The setting sun cast a golden glow over everything, creating an almost romantic atmosphere. We paused at a secluded bench overlooking a small pond. Ducks paddled lazily across the water's surface. Tim sat close to me, our shoulders almost touching. For a moment, I thought he might try to kiss me. My heart raced with anticipation. But then Tim reached into his pocket. I expected him to pull out his phone or maybe a piece of gum. Instead, he produced a small plastic bag filled with colorful pills. My stomach dropped instantly. Tin held the bag out casually like he was offering me a piece of candy. He asked if I wanted to have some fun, his tone light and carefree. I froze, unable to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. How had things changed so quickly? I stammered out a refusal, hoping he was just joking. But Tin's expression darkened immediately. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, hard stare. He grabbed my wrist, gripped painfully tight. His voice became low and threatening as he insisted I stay. Panic set in as I realized how vulnerable I was. We were alone in a secluded part of the park as darkness fell. I had no idea what Tim was capable of. I tried to pull away, but he was much stronger. My mind raced, searching for a way out of this situation. Suddenly, I heard voices approaching on the path. A group of joggers appeared, chatting among themselves. I called out to them, my voice shaky and desperate. Tim immediately released my arm and plastered on a fake smile. He acted like everything was fine as the joggers passed by, completely oblivious to my distress. The moment they were out of sight, I ran. I didn't look back, didn't think, just focused on putting as much distance between Tim and myself as possible. My legs felt weak and shaky, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I didn't stop until I reached a busy street several blocks away. Gasping for breath, I ducked into a crowded coffee shop. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone to call a friend. I kept glancing anxiously at the door, terrified Tim might have followed me. Every time someone entered, my heart jumped into my throat. My friend arrived about 15 minutes later. As soon as I saw her familiar face, the tears I'd been holding back burst forth. She hugged me tightly, then ushered me to her car. During the drive home, I recounted what happened between sobs. My friend was horrified, insisting we report it to the police. Back at my apartment, I felt safer but still on edge. Every noise made me jump. I double-checked all the locks and closed all the curtains. My friend stayed with me, making sure I ate something and helping me calm down. We reported the incident to the dating app and local police, but they said there wasn't much they could do since no actual crime had occurred. The next few days were a blur. I barely slept, plagued by nightmares of what could have happened. I jumped at every sound, convinced Tin was somehow lurking outside. Going to work was a struggle. I felt like everyone was staring at me, even though they had no idea what had happened. Slowly, I started to feel more like myself again, but the incident left its mark. I deleted all my dating profiles, unable to stomach the thought of meeting anyone new. When friends invited me out, I made excuses to stay home. The idea of being in a public place surrounded by strangers filled me with dread. Weeks turned into months. Gradually, I regained my confidence. I started going out again, but always with a group of friends. I was hyper-aware of my surroundings, always looking for potential threats. The carefree person I used to be seemed like a distant memory. One day, about 6 months after the incident, I was grabbing coffee at my favorite cafe. As I waited for my order, I glanced around the room. My blood ran cold as I spotted a familiar face. It was Tim, sitting at a corner table. He hadn't seen me yet. Without thinking, I bolted out the door, leaving my coffee behind. Outside, I leaned against the wall, heart pounding. But then a sense of anger washed over me. Why should I be the one running away? I straightened up, took a deep breath, and walked back inside. Tim looked up as I approached his table. The color drained from his face as he recognized me. Without a word, he quickly gathered his things and left. Watching him hurry away, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I had faced my fear head on and come out stronger. The incident with Tin would always be a part of my story, but it no longer defined me. I was ready to move forward, wiser and more cautious, but no longer afraid. We matched on a dating app and chatted for a week before deciding to meet up. Penny suggested this trendy new Italian place downtown, and I was game. I arrived a few minutes early, nervously adjusting my shirt as I waited outside. When Penny showed up, she looked just like her profile pics, shoulder-length blonde hair and a nice smile. We headed inside and got seated at a cozy corner table. The restaurant had a great ambience with dim lighting and soft music playing. As we looked over the menus, we made small talk about our jobs and hobbies. Penny worked in marketing and was really into rock climbing. I told her about my job in it and my love for photography. I noticed Penny seemed a bit on edge. She kept glancing around the restaurant and fidgeting with her napkin. When I asked if everything was okay, she brushed it off, saying she was just hungry. I figured first date jitters were getting to her and tried to keep the conversation flowing to help her relax. When our waiter came over, Penny took forever to decide what to order. She kept changing her mind and asking detailed questions about every dish. I could see the waiter getting a bit impatient. Finally, she settled on the chicken parmesan. I went with the lasagna. As we waited for our food, I tried asking Penny more about herself, but she gave pretty short answers and didn't really reciprocate by asking me anything. There were a few awkward silences that I scrambled to fill. I started to wonder if we just weren't clicking in person like we had over text. About 20 minutes later, our waiter returned with our meals. He set my lasagna down in front of me, then placed a plate of spaghetti and meatballs in front of Penny. I saw her eyes narrow and her jaw clench. Before I could say anything, she erupted. Penny started screaming at the waiter, calling him every name in the book. She yelled that she'd ordered chicken parmesan, not this slop. The poor guy tried to apologize, but Penny wouldn't let him get a word in. Then she did something I never saw coming. She picked up the plate and hurled it onto the floor. Pasta, sauce, and shards of ceramic went flying everywhere. The entire restaurant went dead silent. All eyes were on our table. I sat there in shock, my face burning with embarrassment. The waiter scurried away, likely to get the manager. Penny was still ranting about the restaurant's incompetence. I tried to calm her down, saying it was just an honest mistake. But she turned on me next, calling me a pushover for defending the waiter. The manager rushed over, profusely apologizing. He offered to comp our entire meal and bring Penny the correct order right away. But she was having none of it. She demanded we leave immediately, grabbing her purse and storming towards the exit. Not knowing what else to do, I followed her out, mouthing "I'm so sorry" to the staff as we left. Once outside, Penny's tantrum continued. She paced back and forth on the sidewalk, ranting about how she was going to leave a scathing review online. I stood there awkwardly, unsure of what to do or say. Part of me wanted to just bail, but I also felt weird about leaving her alone when she was so worked up. Suddenly, we heard a commotion from inside the restaurant. Penny had left her phone on the table, and when a busboy ran out to return it, she accused him of trying to steal it. She shoved the poor kid, causing him to stumble backwards into a nearby bike rack. The bikes came crashing down, and one smashed through the restaurant's front window. Things escalated quickly from there. Someone called the cops. The restaurant owner came out yelling about pressing charges. Penny tried to flee but tripped over one of the fallen bikes. I instinctively reached out to help her up, but she swatted my hand away. Within minutes, police sirens filled the air. 2 squad cars pulled up, and officers jumped out. They started questioning everyone about what happened. I gave a brief statement, my hands shaking as I recounted the evening's events. Penny was handcuffed and put in the back of a police car, still yelling the whole time. One of the officers asked if I was with her. I hesitated before admitting it was supposed to be our first date. He gave me a sympathetic look and suggested I go home. I didn't need to be told twice. I speed-walked several blocks away before finally slowing down to catch my breath. My mind was reeling as I tried to process what had just happened. In all my years of dating, I'd never experienced anything remotely like this. I felt terrible for the restaurant staff and that poor busboy. I considered going back to apologize, but decided that might just make things more awkward. When I got home, I collapsed on my couch, utterly drained. I had about a dozen notifications on my phone. texts from Penny calling me a coward for not defending her, and messages from the dating app asking how our date went. I ignored them all and blocked her number. The next morning, I woke up hoping it had all been a bad dream, but a quick Google search crushed that hope. There were already local news articles about the spaghetti meltdown at the Italian restaurant. Luckily, they didn't mention me by name, but it was surreal seeing last night's chaos described in print. It took a while before I felt ready to try online dating again. When I did, I stuck to coffee shops for first dates. Much easier to make a quick exit if needed, and I always made sure to check if they had any strong feelings about pasta, just to be safe. I was getting ready for a first date with Ross, a guy I'd met on a dating app. We'd been chatting for weeks, and he seemed great on paper. Funny, smart, with a decent job and similar interests. I spent way too long picking out the perfect outfit and doing my makeup. I wanted to make a good impression. The plan was to meet at this cute little cafe downtown. It was a spot I'd been to before, cozy with amazing pastries and coffee. I arrived a few minutes early, feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. As I walked in, I spotted Ross right away. He was sitting at a table near the window, but my heart sank when I realized he wasn't alone. There was another guy with him, someone I didn't recognize. As I approached, Ross stood up awkwardly to greet me. He introduced the other man as his buddy Mike, saying he just happened to run into him and invited him to join us. I tried to hide my disappointment and confusion. This wasn't how I pictured our first date going. We all sat down, and an uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Ross seemed weirdly nervous, fidgeting with his coffee cup and barely making eye contact. Mike, on the other hand, was staring at me intently. It made me feel like I was being sized up or evaluated. I tried to break the ice by asking Ross about his week, but every time he started to answer, Mike would cut in with a question for me. Where did I work? What were my hobbies? Did I have family in the area? How long had I lived here? It felt less like casual conversation and more like an interrogation. As the strange back and forth continued, I started to get a weird feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something about this whole situation felt off. Ross was barely saying anything, just sipping his coffee and looking increasingly uncomfortable. I began to wonder if this was some kind of setup or prank. After about 20 minutes of this bizarre interaction, I'd had enough. I excused myself to use the restroom, planning to slip out the back door and go home. But as I stood up, I noticed two men enter the cafe. They were both large and intimidating, dressed in dark clothes. Something about them immediately set off alarm bells. The men scanned the room and then locked eyes on our table. They started walking purposefully in our direction. Ross saw them too, and his face went pale. In an instant, he was on his feet, grabbing my arm and pulling me towards the back of the cafe. Mike was right behind us. We burst out the back door into an alley just as shouts and the sound of breaking glass erupted from inside the cafe. Ross was practically dragging me down the alley, Mike bringing up the rear. I could hear heavy footsteps behind us. The men were in pursuit. My heart was pounding as we ran through a maze of back alleys and side streets. I had no idea where we were going or what was happening. My legs were burning and my lungs felt like they would explode, but pure adrenaline and fear kept me going. We ducked around corners and through narrow passages, trying to lose our pursuers. At one point, we had to scale a chain-link fence. Mike gave me a boost, and I scraped my hands on the way over. The sound of angry voices was getting closer. Finally, we ducked into the loading dock of some nondescript building. We crouched behind some dumpsters, trying to catch our breath as quietly as possible. I could hear the men run past our hiding spot, their footsteps echoing in the quiet street. We stayed there for what felt like hours, hardly daring to move or breathe. Every small sound made me jump. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Who were those men? Why were they after Ross? When Ross finally decided the coast was clear, we emerged from our hiding spot. I was shaking all over, the reality of what just happened hitting me. Ross looked shell-shocked, his face pale and sweaty. Mike, oddly, seemed fairly calm. Ross started apologizing profusely, words tumbling out in a rushed, panicked stream. Through his rambling explanation, I pieced together that he owed money to some very bad people. He'd gotten mixed up in something he shouldn't have, thinking he could make some quick cash. But things had spiraled out of control. He brought Mike along as backup, thinking it would keep him safe if the men he owed showed up. Apparently, He never expected them to actually find him. Mike was some kind of security consultant or bodyguard. I wasn't clear on the details. As the adrenaline wore off, I felt a wave of anger wash over me. How could Ross put me in danger like this? This was supposed to be a nice first date, and instead I ended up running for my life. I told Ross exactly what I thought of his idiocy, my voice shaking with a mix of fear and fury. Mike suggested we keep moving in case the men came back. We walked quickly through unfamiliar streets, staying alert for any sign of danger. Ross kept trying to apologize, to explain, but I wasn't interested in hearing it. After about an hour of walking, we ended up in a part of town I recognized. I told Ross and Mike that I was going home. Ross looked like he wanted to say something, but Mike put a hand on his shoulder and shook his head. As I walked away, I heard Mike telling Ross they needed to go somewhere safe and figure out their next move. Part of me felt guilty for leaving them, but a bigger part just wanted to be as far away from this mess as possible. I spent the weekend ignoring Ross's attempts to contact me and trying to make sense of what happened. By Monday, I decided to block his number and delete the dating app. One thing was for sure, it was going to be a long time before I agreed to meet anyone from the internet again. It was supposed to be a simple coffee meetup with Laura, a girl I'd been chatting with on a dating app. But from the moment she walked into the cafe, I knew something was off. Laura arrived looking like she'd been in a fight. Her left eye was swollen and dark, a nasty bruise spreading across her cheekbone. Her wrist was wrapped in a bandage, and she winced when she reached for her coffee cup. When I asked what happened, she brushed it off, muttering something about a disagreement with her roommate. I didn't buy it, but I didn't want to push. We tried to make small talk, but the conversation felt forced. Laura seemed distracted, constantly glancing over her shoulder at the door. Her laugh sounded hollow when I attempted jokes. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. About halfway through our date, Laura casually mentioned her ex's name while telling a story. My stomach dropped as I started to connect the dots. Were her injuries actually from him? Was she in some kind of danger? I debated whether I should offer help or if that would be overstepping. But then another, more unsettling thought crept in. What if Laura herself was the dangerous one? Maybe she was involved in something illegal and her ex was after her. Or what if this whole injured damsel act was a setup to lure in unsuspecting guys like me? I found myself on high alert, analyzing Laura's every word and movement for clues. When she excused herself to use the restroom, I seriously considered just leaving. But the thought of abandoning her if she really was in trouble made me stay put. Laura returned looking even more anxious. She suggested we go for a walk to clear her head. Against my better judgment, I agreed. As we strolled down the sidewalk, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched or followed. Laura kept glancing behind us too, confirming my suspicions. Suddenly, a man in a dark hoodie came charging toward us from across the street. Laura tensed up and grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. Before I could react, the man shoved me aside and lunged at Laura. They started struggling, and I heard Laura cry out in pain. In that moment, all my doubts and fears evaporated. Pure instinct took over as I tackled the attacker, trying to pull him off Laura. We all went crashing to the ground in a tangle of limbs. I managed to land a solid punch to the guy's jaw, but then felt a sharp, burning pain in my side. He pulled out a knife. Laura screamed for help as I grappled with the attacker, desperately trying to keep the blade away from my body. My arms were getting sliced up in the process, but adrenaline dulled the pain. I could hear people shouting and running toward us, but they seemed so far away. Just when I thought I was about to get stabbed, Laura cracked the guy over the head with her heavy purse. He went limp for a moment, giving me the chance to pin him down. Within seconds, a crowd had gathered around us. Someone was calling the police while others tried to help restrain the attacker. Everything after that was a blur of flashing lights and questions. The police arrived and took our statements. Paramedics patched up my cuts and checked Laura for injuries. As the adrenaline wore off, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. It turned out the attacker was Laura's abusive ex-boyfriend. He'd been stalking her for weeks, escalating his threats and violence. Laura admitted she'd been too scared to go to the police, worried it would only make things worse. She'd almost canceled our date, but was desperate to feel normal again after weeks of living in fear. As we sat on the curb waiting for the police to finish up, Laura broke down sobbing. She apologized over and over for putting me in danger. I was still in shock, unsure how to process everything that had happened. Part of me wanted to just go home and never see Laura again. But looking at how broken and vulnerable she seemed, I couldn't bring myself to abandon her. I ended up giving Laura a ride to her sister's place, where she'd be staying until she could find somewhere safer to live. On the drive, she opened up about her relationship with her ex. How it had started out great but slowly turned controlling and abusive. How she'd tried to leave multiple times but always got pulled back in by his apologies and promises to change. Listening to Laura's story, I felt a mix of emotions. Anger at her ex for what he'd done, sadness that she'd been trapped in such a terrible situation, and a strange protectiveness I hadn't expected to feel for someone I barely knew. When we arrived at her sister's, Laura hesitated before getting out of the car. She turned to me with tears in her eyes and thanked me for potentially saving her life. I didn't know what to say. I just nodded and told her to call me if she needed anything. On the drive home, my hands were shaking as the events of the night replayed in my mind. I kept thinking about how differently things could have gone if I'd bailed when I first got suspicious. Laura could have been seriously hurt or worse. The next few days were a whirlwind. I gave another statement to the police and found out Laura's ex had been arrested and charged with assault and stalking. Laura texted to check on me and let me know she was working with victim advocates to make a safety plan. I couldn't help but marvel at how life can change in an instant. What was supposed to be a casual first date had turned into a life or death situation. While it wasn't the start to a relationship I had ever imagined, I had a feeling Laura and I would be in each other's lives for a long time to come. Darren seemed charming in our chats, so I agreed to meet him at a cozy cafe downtown. Little did I know this evening would spiral into a terrifying ordeal that would leave me questioning everything. I arrived at the cafe a few minutes early, nervously smoothing my dress as I stepped inside. Darren was already there, waving me over to a table by the window. My first impression was positive. He was even more handsome than his profile pictures, with kind eyes and an easy smile. We ordered our drinks and fell into comfortable conversation. Darren was witty and attentive, asking thoughtful questions about my job and hobbies. I started to relax, thinking maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. But then things took an unsettling turn. Darren casually mentioned how much he loved my vacation photos from Italy. I felt a chill run down my spine. I hadn't told him about that trip, and my social media accounts were set to private. There was no way he should have seen those pictures. I tried to keep my voice steady as I asked how he'd seen the photos. Darren just shrugged it off with a vague comment about having his ways. Alarm bells were ringing in my head. How much did this guy really know about me? As we continued talking, more red flags popped up. Darren brought up my favorite restaurant, which I'd never mentioned to him. He asked about my sister by name. With each comment, my unease grew. I found myself watching the exits, wondering if I should make an excuse to leave. Just as I was about to fake an emergency text, chaos erupted outside the cafe. Two men were shouting at each other on the sidewalk, their argument quickly escalating. Before I could process what was happening, one of them pulled out a knife. Panic swept through the cafe. People were screaming, knocking over chairs as they rushed toward the back. Darren grabbed my arm and pulled me down under our table. I was too shocked to resist, crouching there as the sounds of the fight grew louder. Through the window, I could see flashes of movement. The men were grappling with each other, the knife glinting in the streetlight. Someone shouted for the police. I heard glass shattering and more angry yelling. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I was acutely aware of Darren's body next to mine, his arms still gripping me tightly. Part of me was grateful for his protective instinct, but another part was terrified. I still didn't know how much I could trust this man who'd somehow access my private information. The fight seemed to go on forever. I could hear sirens in the distance, gradually getting closer. Darren kept whispering that it would be okay, but I wasn't sure if he was trying to reassure me or himself. Finally, the police arrived. I heard shouts of "drop the weapon" and "get on the ground." There was a scuffle, then the click of handcuffs. Slowly, the chaos outside began to subside. Darren cautiously peeked out from under the table. "I think it's over," he said softly. "Are you all right?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. My legs felt shaky as I stood up. The cafe was a disaster zone. Overturned chairs, spilled drinks, broken glass everywhere. Most of the other customers had fled out the back door. Darren put his hand on my lower back, guiding me toward the exit. I was still too rattled to protest. As we stepped outside, I saw the aftermath of the fight. There were spots of blood on the sidewalk. Two men were in handcuffs, being put into separate police cars. "Let me walk you home," Darren said. "It's not safe for you to be alone right now." I hesitated. After everything that had happened, I wasn't sure if I wanted to be alone with him, but I was still shaken up, and the thought of walking home by myself was equally unappealing. Reluctantly, I agreed. We walked in tense silence for a few blocks. My mind was racing, trying to process the events of the evening. The unsettling revelations about Darren's knowledge of me, followed by the terrifying violence we just witnessed. It was almost too much to take in. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I stopped walking and turned to face Darren. "How did you really know about my illy photos?" I demanded. "And all that other stuff about me. Have you been stalking me?" Darren looked uncomfortable. He ran a hand through his hair, avoiding my gaze. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I shouldn't have done that. I really wanted to impress you. So I did some digging online. I know it was wrong." I stared at him, not sure how to respond. Part of me was furious at the invasion of privacy, but another part was oddly touched that he'd gone to such lengths because he liked me. Before I could decide how to react, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure was emerging from the shadows of a nearby alley, walking purposefully toward us. As he got closer, I realized with horror that it was one of the men from the fight. Somehow he must have escaped police custody. The man's face was bloody, his eyes wild. In his hand, he clutched the knife from earlier. "Give me your wallets," he snarled. "Now." I froze, terror washing over me. Not again. This couldn't be happening. Darren stepped in front of me protectively. "Take it easy, man," he said, his voice low and steady. "We don't want any trouble." The mugger lunged forward, slashing with the knife. Darren shoved me out of the way, the blade catching his arm instead of my chest. He cried out in pain, but managed to grab the man's wrist, struggling to disarm him. I stumbled backward, my mind blank with panic. What should I do? Run for help? Try to intervene? The two men grappled on the sidewalk, trading blows. Blood was seeping through Darren's shirt sleeve. The mugger was snarling, still trying to bring the knife to bear. Suddenly, I remember the pepper spray in my purse. With shaking hands, I fumbled it out and pointed it at the attacker's face. I squeezed the trigger, praying it would work. The mugger howled in agony as the spray hit his eyes. He dropped the knife, clawing at his face. Darren scrambled away, snatching up the weapon. "Run," he shouted at me. We took off down the street, not looking back. I could hear the mugger's agonized screams fading behind us. We didn't stop running until we reached my apartment building. Both of us were gasping for breath, adrenaline still coursing through our veins. Darren's arm was bleeding badly. "We need to call the police," I panted, "and get you to a hospital." Darren nodded weakly, leaning against the wall. As I pulled out my phone to dial the cops, I realized my hands were shaking uncontrollably. The events of the night crashed over me in a wave of delayed shock. Darren reached out and squeezed my hand. Despite everything, I felt a spark of connection. We'd been through hell together tonight. Whatever happened next, that shared experience had forged an unexpected bond between us. As sirens approached once again, I knew this was far from over, but for now we were safe, and somehow against all odds, I had a feeling this wouldn't be our last date after all. I had a first date with a girl I'd met on a dating app. Stella seemed perfect on paper, smart, funny, and drop-dead gorgeous. We agreed to meet at a cozy cafe downtown, and I spent way too long picking out my outfit. I wanted to make a good impression. The cafe was buzzing when I arrived. I spotted Stella immediately. Her dark hair and bright smile stood out in the crowd. My nerves melted away as soon as we started talking. She was even more charming in person, laughing at my jokes and asking thoughtful questions. We bonded over our shared love of travel and rock bands. Before I knew it, an hour had flown by. As the cafe started to clear out, I suggested we take a walk in the nearby park. The evening was perfect, warm with a gentle breeze. Stella agreed enthusiastically. We strolled along the winding paths, our hands brushing occasionally. The spark between us was undeniable. I was already planning our second date in my head. That's when things took a turn. Stella's phone buzzed in her purse. She glanced at it but didn't answer. A minute later, it buzzed again. And again. I figured it must be important, so I gently suggested she check it. Stella hesitated, then pulled out her phone with a sigh. Her face fell as she read the messages. When she looked up at me, her expression was a mix of guilt and fear. She admitted it was her boyfriend texting her. Apparently, he was a jealous type and didn't know she was out on a date. My stomach dropped. I couldn't believe she'd let me out like that. Before I could even process what was happening, I heard angry shouting behind us. A guy was storming towards us, his face contorted with rage. Stella's eyes went wide. She whispered that it was her boyfriend, Jake. He must have followed her somehow. Jake reached us in seconds, getting right in Stella's face. He was massive, at least 6'2", and built like a linebacker. I'm not a small guy, but he had me beat by a good 50 pounds of muscle. Jake started yelling at Stella, demanding to know what she was doing. She tried to calm him down, but he was beyond reason. I knew I had to do something. Even though Stella had lied to me, I couldn't just stand by while this guy intimidated her. I stepped between them, hands raised, and tried to de-escalate. I told Jake there was no need for this, that it was all a misunderstanding. Bad move. Jake's fury turned on me in an instant. He shoved me hard, nearly knocking me off my feet. I stumbled backwards, heart racing. Jake advanced on me, fists clenched. I'm not much of a fighter, but I knew I had to defend myself. As Jake swung at me, I managed to duck. His fist sailed over my head. I countered with a push at his chest, trying to create some distance. But Jake barely budged. He grabbed me by the shirt and hurled me to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of me. Stella was screaming at Jake to stop, but he wasn't listening. He straddled me and started raining down punches. I covered my face with my arms, trying to protect myself. The blows were brutal. I tasted blood in my mouth. Each impact sent shockwaves of pain through my body. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, I heard sirens approaching. Someone must have called the police. Jake hesitated, looking around wildly. I seized my chance and managed to throw him off balance. I scrambled to my feet and ran. My legs were shaky, but adrenaline propelled me forward. I sprinted out of the park and down the street, not daring to look back. The sound of heavy footsteps behind me told me Jake was in pursuit. My lungs burned as I pushed myself to run faster. I weaved through side streets and alleyways trying to lose him. The sirens were getting closer, but so was Jake. I could hear his labored breathing just a few yards behind me. Panic gave me an extra burst of speed. I spotted a crowded bar up ahead and made a split-second decision. I ducked inside, pushing through the packed bodies. I made my way to the back, found the emergency exit, and burst out into another alley. I kept running, praying Jake hadn't seen where I went. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I finally slowed down. I was in a part of town I didn't recognize, surrounded by dark warehouses. My whole body ached. My lip was split and swollen, and I could feel bruises forming on my ribs. But I was alive. I leaned against a wall, gasping for air. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the pain was setting in. I gingerly touched my face, wincing at the tenderness. My shirt was torn and spattered with blood. I must have looked a mess. As my breathing slowed, I tried to get my bearings. I pulled out my phone, relieved to see it wasn't damaged in the fight. I opened my maps app to figure out where I was. To my surprise, I had several missed calls and texts from Stella. I ignored them and called a cab instead. The driver gave me a concerned look when I climbed in, but didn't ask questions. As we drove, the reality of what just happened sank in. My perfect first date had turned into a nightmare. I felt angry at Stella for putting me in that situation. But mostly, I felt shaken. I'd never been in a fight like that before. The violence and fury in Jake's eyes haunted me. When I got home, I locked my door and collapsed on the couch. My phone was still blowing up with messages from Stella. She was apologizing profusely, begging me to talk to her. I blocked her number without responding. That night changed me in ways I'm still discovering, but I refuse to let it define me or close me off from future relationships. I just hope my next first date doesn't involve any surprise boyfriends or fistfights. Once was more than enough. I've been chatting with Randy on a dating app for a few weeks. He seemed nice enough, witty messages, decent job, cute photos. When he suggested meeting up, I figured why not. We agreed on a casual Italian place downtown for dinner on Friday night. I got to the restaurant a few minutes early and waited outside, nervously smoothing my dress. When Randy arrived, he looked pretty much like his photos, tall with dark hair and an easy smile. We said hello and headed inside. The restaurant was cozy and dimly lit. We settled into a quiet corner booth and ordered some wine. At first, the conversation flowed easily. We chatted about our jobs, hobbies, and favorite travel spots. Randy was charming and attentive, asking lots of questions about me. As we ate our pasta, I started to notice some little things that made me slightly uneasy. Randy kept touching my arm or hand when he laughed at something I said. He also leaned in really close across the table, invading my personal space a bit. I brushed it off as first date awkwardness. After we finished eating, Randy suggested we grab a drink at a nearby bar. I was ready to call it a night, but he was pretty insistent. Not wanting to seem rude, I reluctantly agreed. We walked a few blocks to a crowded pub and managed to snag 2 stools at the bar. As we sipped our beers, Randy's questions got more personal. He asked about my dating history, my relationship with my family, even my salary. I gave vague answers, feeling uncomfortable with the probing questions. He'd also kept putting his hand on my knee or lower back. I casually shifted away, but he didn't seem to get the hint. When I finished my drink, I announced that I should head home since I had an early meeting. Randy immediately offered to split an Uber. I politely declined, saying I'd just walk since I lived nearby. He kept pushing, insisting it wasn't safe for me to walk alone at night. I stood my ground and said I'd be fine. As we left the bar, Randy suggested we go back to my place for one last drink. I hesitated, definitely not wanting to invite him over, but he was being really persistent and I didn't want to seem rude after he'd paid for dinner. Against my better judgment, I reluctantly agreed. We walked a few blocks to my apartment building. With each step, I regretted my decision more and more, but I figured I'd just give him a quick tour, have one more drink, and then send him on his way. I unlocked my apartment door with shaky hands and flipped on the lights. Randy immediately made himself at home, kicking off his shoes and flopping onto my couch. I busied myself in the kitchen, hoping he'd take the hint that it was time to leave soon. I poured us each a small glass of wine, planning to drink quickly and usher him out. But as soon as I handed Randy his glass, he stretched out on the couch like he owned the place. I perched awkwardly on the edge of an armchair, feeling tense. We had awkward small talk for a few minutes as I tried to figure out how to politely ask him to leave. Suddenly, Randy set down his glass and announced that he might just stay over tonight. My stomach dropped. He wasn't joking. I stammered out some excuse about having an early meeting, but he waved it off saying he'd be quiet in the morning. I felt trapped in my own home, unsure what to do. My mind raced trying to come up with a plan. I considered texting a friend for help, but my phone was in my purse across the room. Randy was between me and the door. I worried that if I tried to force him to leave, things could escalate. After a moment of panic, I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. I stood up and firmly said I wasn't comfortable with him staying over. Randy looked annoyed, but finally seemed to get the message. He grumbled as he put his shoes back on, muttering something about me being a tease. I walked him to the door, my heart pounding. As soon as he was out, I quickly locked it behind him and put on the chain. I leaned against the door in relief, but then heard Randy lingering in the hallway. I looked through the peephole and saw him pacing back and forth, talking to himself angrily. Terrified he might try to come back in, I called the police with shaking hands. They arrived within minutes, and I watched through the window as they escorted Randy away. An officer took my statement and assured me they'd keep an eye on the area. I barely slept that night, jumping at every little sound. The next day, I asked my landlord to change my locks just in case. I also blocked Randy's number and removed my profile from the dating app. For weeks afterwards, I was constantly on edge. I checked my peephole obsessively before opening my door. I'd scan every crowd for Randy's face when I was out. Eventually the fear faded, but I never forgot that night. Looking back, I can see all the red flags I missed along the way. Randy's pushiness, the inappropriate touching, the personal questions. It all added up to bad news. I learned an important lesson about trusting my instincts and prioritizing my safety over politeness. These days, I'm much more cautious about online dating. I'll always meet in public places, dry myself, and let friends know where I'll be. Most importantly, I'm not afraid to speak up or leave if I feel uncomfortable. No date is worth compromising my safety and peace of mind. Little did I know my date with Ben would spiral into a terrifying ordeal that would leave me questioning my safety and sanity. The date itself was forgettable. We met at a mid-range Italian place downtown. Ben was average-looking with neatly combed brown hair and glasses. He worked in IT and liked hiking. I shared bits about my marketing job and my cat. The conversation was polite but stilted, with awkward silences stretching between topics. By the time we finished our pasta, it was clear there wasn't much chemistry. We said a cordial goodbye outside the restaurant, and I assumed that would be the end of it. The next morning, I went on my usual routine. I grabbed coffee on my way to work, spent the day in meetings and answering emails, then stopped by the grocery store on my way home. It wasn't until I was settling in for the evening that things took a bizarre turn. My phone buzzed with an unfamiliar notification. "Unknown AirTag moving with you," it read. I frowned, confused. I didn't own any AirTags. I dismissed it, figuring it was a glitch, but a few minutes later another alert popped up, and then another. A knot formed in my stomach as I opened the Find My app. There it was, a small blue dot, tracking my every movement throughout the day. To work, to lunch, to the store, and now to my apartment. Someone had planted a tracker on me. Panic rising, I dumped out my purse and coat pockets. Nothing. I ran my hands along the seams of my bag, and that's when I felt it. A small lump in the lining. With shaking hands, I carefully cut open the seam. My breath caught as I pulled out a round, white AirTag. My mind raced. How did this get here? When the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. It had to have been Ben. He must have slipped it into my purse during our date when I wasn't looking. I felt sick. This guy I barely knew had been secretly following my every move for the past 24 hours. He knew where I lived, where I worked, everywhere I went. The implications were terrifying. I paced my apartment, unsure what to do. Should I call the police? But what proof did I have that it was Ben? Maybe I was jumping to conclusions. I texted my friend Sam, hoping she could help me think clearly. While waiting for her reply, I double-checked all my locks and peered out the peephole, half expecting to see Ben lurking in the hallway. My phone buzzed and I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was just Sam, urging me to file a police report and offering to come over. As I was texting Sam my address, another notification made my blood run cold. The AirTag was on the move again, and it was getting closer to my apartment. My heart pounded. Was Ben actually coming here? With trembling fingers, I dialed 911. The operator said officers were on their way, but it would be about 10 minutes. Those minutes crawled by as I huddled in my bedroom closet, clutching my phone and watching the blue dot inch closer. The AirTag stopped moving. It was right outside my building. The knock at the door nearly made me scream, but then I heard Sam calling my name. I ran to let her in, beyond relieved to not be alone. We sat together on the couch, constantly refreshing the app. After what felt like hours, the AirTag finally started moving away. We both exhaled sharply, the tension slightly easing. The police arrived shortly after. I showed them the AirTag and explained everything. They took my statement but warned it might be difficult to prove it was Ben without more evidence. They promised to investigate and advised me to stay with a friend for the night. I spent a fitful night on Sam's couch, jumping at every sound. The next day, we went to the phone store to have my devices scanned for other trackers or spyware. I changed all my passwords and locked down my social media accounts. Days passed with no further incidents, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, scrutinizing every stranger on the street. Was that Ben across the cafe? Did that car just drive by too slowly? A week after the AirTag incident, I was walking home from work when I spotted a familiar figure on the street ahead. My heart stopped. It was Ben. He hadn't seen me yet. I ducked into a nearby store, pretending to browse while watching him through the window. Ben lingered on the corner, checking his phone repeatedly. Was he looking for me? Tracking me? After a few minutes, he started walking in the direction of my apartment building. Panic gripped me. I had to do something. I called the police, my voice shaking as I explained the situation. They said an officer was on the way, but urged me to get somewhere safe in the meantime. I texted Sam, who said she'd meet me at a coffee shop a few blocks away. I waited until Ben was out of sight, then hurried out of the store. I took a roundabout route to the coffee shop, constantly glancing over my shoulder. Every person I passed looked suspicious. Every car seemed to be following me. I made it to the coffee shop and collapsed into a chair, my nerves frayed. Sam arrived a few minutes later, followed shortly by 2 police officers. They took my statement and said they would look for Ben in the area. They finally caught Ben after a few weeks, and that gave me some peace of mind, but this incident was so crazy that I never even felt like looking at another man again.